All right, well, welcome to the second part of the Campaigns and Elections lecture. If you'll remember from our last lecture, we were talking about the Electoral College and how the process of presidential elections work in the United States. And so today we're going to go right off of that discussion and talk a little bit about the entire electoral process, including the campaign portion. And this should be directly applicable to what you see happening in the United States right now as we gear up for the presidential election in November of next year. You'll remember that as part of our discussion on the election process, we talked about the primaries, and you'll remember that the primary is an election with the purpose of narrowing down the fields of candidates so that you have one candidate from each of the two major parties running against one another, and that nomination of each of those candidates happens during the national convention process. So one of the things that you can think of is that campaigns have a natural four-step progression. We're going to kind of think of it slightly differently in that we've already talked about primaries in the National Convention, and now we're sort of talking about the process of running for office. So think back prior to the primaries that candidates will announce their candidacy when they decide that they want to run, and they begin by building and creating a formal campaign organization. Now, when a candidate decides that they want to run for president, the first thing that they must do is to begin both raising money, but also to begin building name recognition. And this is a really important component, because as you may remember, we talked about voters lack a certain level of sophistication, and when voters go to cast a ballot, they are likely to have very little substantive knowledge of the candidates and their issue positions. They're often going to rely on shortcuts. That is, voters are going to rely on shortcuts when casting their ballots. Some of the shortcuts that they're going to rely on are going to be partisan identification, whether someone's a Democrat or Republican, but also whether or not they recognize someone's name. And so a voter may know very little about a candidate's actual positions, but may recognize their name, and that would make the voter more likely or sometimes less likely to vote for that candidate. So it's important that candidates begin to build their names so that when voters go to the booth, they will recognize that candidate above all others. Additionally, it's important that candidates begin building or raising money, and this is obviously an incredibly important component because as you may well know, the primary season has become longer and longer. So where it used to just be a few months, not only is the primary season stretched out, but it is happening, the actual campaigning process is stretched out as well, where most candidates are running for president for at least a year and a half, sometimes 2 years before the actual election. So candidates need to raise substantial amounts of money to be able to make it through that long process. So you want to think about that. And remember, too, that we talked about the very nature of the Electoral College may, in fact, affect how candidates not only think about winning, but also how they campaign. And this really fits into number 2. Remember, we talked about the Electoral College and each state having electoral votes equal to their number of representatives plus their number of senators. So some states like California have 56 electoral votes, while other states like South Dakota, for instance, only have 3. So when you think about candidates raising certain amounts of money, now certainly when you're looking at someone like Barack Obama, we know that in 2008, Barack Obama raised a little over $700 million. And estimated to raise almost $1 billion this time. In fact, if you're interested, go to the website www.opensecrets.org and take a look at the tab for politicians, and you can look at the amount of money that the candidates are raising. So even though they're raising, significant amounts of money, they have to think about where they want to spend that money, and they want to spend the money in a place where it's going to give them their biggest bang for their buck. So going back to the state's electoral vote counts, what we know then is candidates are going to spend the money in states that have large electoral vote totals, or those states that are battleground states. And remember, we talked about the fact that in many states, the margins of victory are becoming smaller and smaller, and those are what we call battleground states. They could go red or blue. And so when you look at the money that candidates spend and the time that they spend in states, they're usually going to go after the states with the big totals, and or more importantly, the states that are up for grabs. For instance, Barack Obama is not going to spend time in Texas because Texas always goes red, where a Republican candidate is not going to spend a lot of time in California because California goes blue, despite the fact that they have huge vote totals. However, states like Florida or Ohio or North Carolina that have a good size vote total but are also battleground states are where candidates are going to spend more time and more money advertising and building a name for themselves. This also obviously affects how they run for office and how they sort of organize their campaign. So again, they're going to create that formal campaign structure. They're going to begin going through states based on what they know about states. They'll also change their campaign message depending on the states that they move to. So for instance, when they're in states in for instance, the Southwest, like Nevada or Arizona or California or Texas, they're obviously going to be speaking a lot about immigration because those are big issues there. Where they're up in the Northeast, they're going to be talking about issues of civil rights, for instance. So it depends on where the candidates are. They're going to be using polling data and previous voting data to really assess and tailor their campaign strategy to meet the particular electorate that they are speaking to. And then again, whichever candidate wins the most primaries or caucuses receives their party's formal nomination at the National Convention, step 4. So that gives you a better sense of how candidates run for office. Now I want to talk a little bit about the actual process of winning elections, and we're going to look specifically at the drawing of different district lines. We talked a little bit about this in our last lecture, so this should be somewhat familiar to you, but let's just go over it again. So when candidates are running for office and when they're facing one another in elections, there are two methods of determining who the winner is. The first is called majority. And remember, we talked about a mathematical majority being 50 plus 1%. So as you can see by the example I've given here, Barack Obama secures 50% of the vote, Hillary Clinton at 30, and John Edwards at 20. No candidate has secured 50 plus 1% of the vote. Thus, in a majority system, a runoff will be held between the top two vote getters. Remind yourself that southern states use the majority system, but also the Electoral College. You might remember that to win the Electoral College, a candidate must secure 270 electoral votes, which is a majority of 538. So southern states and the Electoral College. All other states use a plurality system. Plurality meaning most. So again, at the same example where Barack Obama has secured 50% of the vote, he is declared the winner because although not a mathematical majority, that is the most votes of all the candidates. So plurality systems allow for easier elections, but and thus maybe why most states use them. Okay, so in addition to majority versus plurality, there's also another important component, which is the winner-take-all versus proportional. Again, this should sound slightly familiar to you when we talked about the Electoral College. Remember, in the example that I gave you, we talked about that when looking at the results from Georgia in 2008, John McCain won the state of Georgia with 52% of our state's popular vote. Because John McCain won 52% of the state's popular vote, he received all of Georgia's 16 Electoral College votes. That is a winner-take-all system. In the example as you see in front of you, we have a single district. We're electing one individual for that district. Whichever candidate secures the most, or a majority, depending on the state, whichever candidate receives that necessary threshold of votes, that candidate becomes the winner, and the person who comes in second or third place receives nothing. The opposite of that is what we call a proportional system. And you'll notice in a proportional system, first of all, rather than having a single district and a single member, you have all of the seats in the legislature up for grab. And as a voter, you are given that number of votes. So for instance, you would be given 10 votes. And then you may distribute your votes however you see fit. Now you'll probably notice in the example some subtle differences. First of all, in the proportional example, you have parties listed rather than persons. this is important to know, that in a proportional system of elections, you are going to be voting for parties rather than people. Once the parties know their seats, then the parties will in fact pick the candidates, which is a caution for many voters who don't like the idea of not being able to know who in fact their elected officials will be. The other thing you may notice is a lot more choices under the proportional system than under the winner-take-all. And this is for obvious reasons. When you look at a proportional system, this is how it works. The parties will receive seats in the legislature that are proportional to the percentage of the vote that they receive. So for instance, the Republicans receive 50% of the vote, so they receive 50% of the seats in the legislature, which is 5 seats. Democrats receive 30% of the vote, so they receive 30% of the seats in the legislature, or 3 seats, and therefore going down the list. So, as you can see, voters are not faced with the choice of picking a likely winner or wasting their vote on a third party that won't win. They don't have to worry about winning, they simply have to get something. So when you're looking at the Green Party, you say to yourself, well, in a winner-take-all system, I wouldn't vote for the Green Party because the Green Party will never win and I won't get any representation. In a proportional system, you say to yourself, the Green Party may not get the most votes, but they'll get something, which means I'll have some representation in the legislature. So a proportional system on its face seems more fair, but remember, when it comes to the Electoral College, only 2 states, Nebraska and Maine, use this system. And what's interesting is that in 2000, after the sort of botched election, remember we looked at the fact that Al Gore won the popular vote while George Bush the Electoral College vote. There were several states that considered moving from a winner-take-all to a proportional system. And in those 9 states that considered this measure, it failed in all 9. And the reason is pretty straightforward, in that states look at themselves and say, okay, if we move to a proportional system, our vote will be lessened. For instance, look at Georgia. The left-hand side with the red and blue shows you which candidate, McCain being red, Obama being blue, won which counties in the state of Georgia. Had Georgia been using the proportional system in 2008, Barack Obama would have likely secured 5 of Georgia's electoral votes. You can see the areas that are circled there. Georgia would have won 5 of, Barack Obama would have won 5 of Georgia's electoral votes rather than receiving none. So had we used a proportional system, Barack Obama would have won 5 and John McCain 11. But as I was saying a second ago, this measure failed in a number of states because they see that as being less powerful. They'd rather have the ability to sort of move the election by having 16 votes than having a few votes and not being as important in the process. Think of a state like California. It's almost impossible to win the Electoral College without the state of California because of the significant number of votes, 56. If you cut that up and spread it out amongst candidates, that lessens the impact that California has in the electoral process. So by the example here, it may be more fair that Barack Obama would have gotten something. It would have perhaps made Georgia less important overall because it would have lessened the total number of electoral votes that they contributed to the system. So you can see why voters may be reluctant to embrace a switch. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is the process of drawing or determining districts and drawing them. Now remember, again, when we talk about the Electoral College, we talk about the fact that states receive electoral votes equal to their number of representatives plus their senators. Remember that each state has 2 senators, and representation in the House is based on population. So that's what we're going to focus on right now, is the representation in the House. Remember, every 10 years we conduct a census in this country. We send out questionnaires to every household asking a series of questions. We ask about their race and their economic status and their occupation, their family size. And the reasons why we conduct a census are really twofold. The first is we want to get a good demographic snapshot of what America looks like. You know, what kind of racial composition we have and economic levels and variations, that sort of thing. We want to be able to describe America. But the other reason is for the purposes of determining representation in the House. We need to count the number of people that both live in the United States and that live in each particular state. And that is necessary for the purposes of representation, as well as it is used to determine federal funding levels to states for things like education and highway and welfare and Medicaid, those sorts of things. So censuses are important, and you may remember during the last census in 2010 that if you didn't complete your census and send it back, they would send someone to your house. In fact, they would send someone to your house 3 times before they would give up, again showing how important this process is. So once we conduct a census, then we have to do a little bit of basic math. So let's talk a little bit about the basic math here. First of all, we take all of the citizens of the United States, which is roughly 310 million Americans. So we look at the census and we say, okay, there are 310 million Americans. Now remember, there are 435 seats in the House of Representatives. So remember that number, 435. We automatically subtract 50 from 435 so that each state gets 1 representative. So 435 minus 50 equals 385. So we know that there are 385 seats in the House of Representatives that will be distributed based on population. We take the population of the United States, 310 million, and we divide by 385 seats. And that will tell us that each representative, each one of those seats, will represent roughly 710,767 people. So each representative will represent roughly 710,000 people. That's the first step. Now, what's important to note is that 435 in the House of Representatives is constitutionally fixed, meaning even if the population of the United States expands exponentially between now and the 2020 census, the House will remain at 435 unless the Constitution is amended. And the reason for that is 435 is already a very large number. To expand the size of the House may make it unwieldy, right? It'd be almost impossible for them to get anything done. It's almost impossible to get anything done now. So the number 435 would not go up. So at the 2020 census, let's say America's population goes up to 400 million. We would divide 400 million by 385, and that would tell us that 1 representative would equal whatever that number is, maybe close to 1 million. So the number of people represented, per representative will simply go up as the population goes up because the House is fixed at 435. Once we determine that the number of representatives or people per representative is 710,000, then we have to look at the population of our states. So we look at our state population and we see that the state of Georgia has roughly 10 million people. So we divide Georgia's population of 10 million by the number that we got earlier, 710,000, and that tells us that the state of Georgia will have roughly 14 representatives. So that is the process of reapportionment. It is reapportioning or handing out portions of the House every 10 years based on those changes. Now, the important thing to note, though, because the number in the House is fixed, it's not a growing number, it's really a reshuffling, and you can see it here on the map. The states that are listed in dark blue got 2 or more since the last census. The states in the medium blue, South Carolina, Georgia, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, Washington, they gained 1. So if you add up the states in the medium blue plus the states in the dark blue, that number should equal the number of seats lost. So those would be the number of seats gained, and then the states in the sort of light orange and the darker orange, those are states that lost. And remember, because it's fixed at 435, they should equal out. So let's try it and see it. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We should have 10 lost then because we had 10 gain. So there's 1, lost my mouse there, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Are we missing a blue state here? I feel like I'm missing one because it has to equal out. So we must be missing a blue state. 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 12. Oh, I got it. It's 2 or more. Sorry. That just goes to show you, even when I'm recording, I make mistakes. So Texas and Florida both gained 3. So that makes 12 gained and then 12 lost. So you see it's a reshuffling. And this pattern shows what we know to be true in the United States, that people are moving out of this area known as the snow belt down to this area known as the sun belt. And we'll continue to see that happen over the years. And remember, when we looked at the margins, it's no wonder that we see these states becoming battlegrounds, because we have different ideologies moving from the north, blue, into these traditional red states. Okay, so that shows you what the process of reapportionment is, determining how many seats a state has. Now, once a state is given their number of seats, then we begin the process of redistricting. So this process is done by the state legislatures, and the state legislatures, once they know how many representatives they have, they need to draw districts that have roughly equal numbers of people. That magic number earlier, 710,000. So Georgia gained 1 seat. So that means the Georgia State Legislature must redraw district lines. They must create 14 districts, and they must create 14 districts that have roughly 710,000 people. Now, you can see here on the map that at the areas that are most concentrated in the urban suburban areas, you're going to have a lot more people, and so you're going to have much more compact districts. Whereas you can see down at the bottom in southern Georgia and northern Georgia, where you have fewer people, you're going to have larger districts. Now, the process of redistricting may seem like an easy one. You simply draw the seats or districts so that everybody has roughly 710,000, but this process becomes highly political, and that's what gerrymandering is. Gerrymandering is when the district lines are drawn in such a way as to give a particular race or ethnic group or party an advantage. So rather than simply drawing them based on population, the state legislature will look at who the people are. What is their race? How have they voted in past elections as Democrat and Republicans? And they will try to draw those district lines in such a way as to achieve a particular outcome. So for instance, when you go back and look at this map, you see on the left-hand side map some really strange looking districts. Look at the 11th district. It starts almost at the top of Georgia, goes halfway down the state. It loops up to the right and has this area that almost is disconnected, and that the 8th is actually cut into pieces here. Also look down at the bottom at the 1st. It's got this sort of crab claw thing. And you look at yourself and you say to yourself, it's obvious that that particular map was drawn not based solely on people, but based on where certain people live. So let's look at gerrymandering a little bit more closely. When we talk about gerrymandering, you know that political scientists like to come up with names, and so political scientists have come up with 4 types of gerrymandering: cracking, packing, hijacking, and kidnapping. The first type, cracking, is where a legislature will draw district lines to disperse the members of a group across 2 legislative districts, in essence diluting their strength. So let me show you an example here of cracking. Here's an example. This is Columbus, Ohio. So in the square you have the city of Columbus, Ohio. Like most major urban centers, it's predominantly Democrat and predominantly minority. So the legislature in the state of Ohio said, if we draw one district as the square, we're likely to get a Democrat representative. And then the remaining areas in the yellow, blue, and red, if we added those up and created 2 other districts, we'd probably get 1 Democrat within the square, and then we'd likely get 1 Republican from the suburban areas and another Republican from the southern suburban areas. So you get 1 Republican, 2 Republican, and 1 Democrat. So they said to themselves, how can we prevent any Democrat from getting elected? Well, here's how we do it. We take the Democrats in the city of Columbus and we crack them up. So we put 30% of the Democrats in District 15. We put 30% of those Democrats in District 12. And we put the remaining 40% in District 7. So now we get 3 predominantly Republican districts, and we'll have no Democrat elected. That's an example of cracking. Take a group and crack them up. Packing is simply the opposite. You take a group and you concentrate those members into as few districts as possible, again with the purpose of diluting their strength. This is the most famous example of packing, and this is the 12th district in North Carolina. It goes from almost the top of the state, right at the top above Winston-Salem is the state of Virginia. It goes all the way from Virginia down to the bottom of Charlotte, which is almost in South Carolina. So this district expands over 100 miles. And for many places you can see on the map that it is only I-85. It's actually a mile or so on the highway. The question is, why draw a district that's so long, that's so distant, and that has the highway as its connector? Well, first of all, the rule is that districts must be contiguous, which means they must be connected. So they had to keep this district connected. And the reason why they drew it this way was they wanted to pack. So if you look at the district this way, at the bottom you have Charlotte, which is predominantly Democrat and minority, and at the top you have Winston-Salem-High Point, which is predominantly Democrat minority. So if you drew one district at the top with Winston-Salem-High Point, you drew one district in the middle, and then the third district at the bottom where Charlotte is, you're likely to end up with one Democrat in the Charlotte area, one Republican in the midsection, and another Democrat at the top. So what they decided to do was, rather than chance having two minority Democrats, they would pack all of the African Americans into a single district so that African Americans would make up 80% of this district rather than 40% in each of two subsequent districts. This this district went to the United States Supreme Court and resulted in the case of Shaw versus Reno, which is in your text. And what the court ruled in Shaw versus Reno is that gerrymandering itself is not unconstitutional. It is only unconstitutional when it is based solely on race. So that states can redistrict and gerrymander based on race and party, for instance, but not race. The 12th district was eventually declared unconstitutional and had to be drawn. Going off of that same point, the map that I showed you earlier of the state of Georgia, on the left you see, this was eventually determined to be unconstitutional as well, and let me tell you why. Go back to our discussion of all of the things that southern states used during the later 19th century and early 20th century to prevent black people from voting: poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses. Remember that all of those things were declared illegal in the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The other thing that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 had in it was a requirement that any time southern states redistrict, they must submit their plans to the Department of Justice for approval. Well, in 2000, following the 2000 census, the state of Georgia submitted the plan to the left to the Department of Justice, and after they stopped laughing, they sent it back to the state of Georgia and said it is clearly a case of racial gerrymandering, and that the district lines had to be drawn so that they were not only contiguous, but so that they were compact. The other idea is, remember, senators are supposed to represent your whole state, but districts are supposed to be closer to you. So you want the people in a district to not only be roughly equal, but you want them to be somewhat alike so that they have a shared interest, and that so that their representative can really represent that which is closest to them. So the plan on the left was rejected, and eventually what you see on the right was what the state of Georgia resubmitted and had approved following the 2000 census. So the process of redistricting is obviously a highly political one, and one that, according to the Voting Rights Act, may take some time. Excuse me, the final examples of gerrymandering, let me go back to that slide, that I want to talk about are hijacking and kidnapping, and these really go together. Hijacking is where you separate an incumbent from his or her district and place them in a district where nobody knows them, where they have no name recognition. Remember, incumbent means the person in office, so essentially you draw a member out of their district. And then you end up kidnapping them by placing them in a district with somebody else who is well known. So let me show you an example, and there are two examples here in the state of Georgia. First of all, these are two districts that existed before the 2000 redrawing. So you see at the top you have the 9th district, which goes from the top of Georgia all the way down to sort of the midsection. But you notice there's a large chunk in the middle of the 9th district which is missing. Now, here's what's interesting. That district, let me go back one more slide. Here we go. You see that big chunk missing out of the 9th district. That was the 12th district, you see. So you think about it like a puzzle. The 9th district cut around Athens, and Athens and Savannah were the length of the 12th district. So the 12th district fit into the 9th district. Now, the 9th district was represented by a man by the name of Charlie Norwood, who was a Republican representative, a long-standing Republican, and the 12th district was represented by someone by the name of Jim Marshall, who was a Democrat. So the state of Georgia, when they were redrawing the districts, they said, okay, the 9th is a Republican, the 12th is a Democrat. How can we get that Democrat out? Oh, I know what we can do. We can change the 12th district. Remember, at the top, this is what the 12th district used to look like, including Athens and Savannah, two predominantly liberal areas. So the 12th district had Jim Marshall, a Democrat. So this is what the legislature did at the bottom. They cut Athens out of the 12th district. They cut Athens out of the 12th district so that Jim Marshall, who actually lived in Athens, no longer lived in the 12th district because the 12th district no longer included Jim Marshall. So essentially they hijacked him. They cut him out of his district and he no longer lived in the 12th district. He now lived in the 10th district. Remember, this is what the 9th district used to look like. They made the 9th district the 10th district, and they included the city of Athens. So now Charlie Norwood, who became the new representative for the 10th, which used to be the 9th, is up against Jim Marshall from the city of Athens, which is an example of kidnapping. Let me go back. Sorry about that. So Jim Marshall in Athens is now running against Charlie Norwood, the representative from the 10th district. That's an example of kidnapping. So let me go back. What did Jim Marshall do? Jim Marshall sold his house and he moved from Athens to Savannah. He ran in the 12th district and he won. So Jim Marshall became the representative for the 12th and Charlie Norwood remained the representative for the 10th district. So a good example of kidnapping and of hijacking, again showing you that this is a highly political process and not simply one of drawing district lines to make sure that the districts are equal.